Picture the most financially independent woman you know. Maybe it's your mother, your boss, a friend. Maybe it's you. She has her own bank account, her own credit card, her own apartment leased in her own name. She can take out a loan, start a business, sign a contract, all without asking permission from anyone. This feels obvious. Almost not worth saying, but 50 years ago, just 50 years, none of this was possible. Not because women weren't capable, not because they didn't work, not because they weren't educated, because the law said no. Explicitly, deliberately, in writing. And what makes this story even more extraordinary is how recently it changed, and how few people know exactly when.
Imagine a home of our own. A home made of smiles and love, of hope and cheer. A home safe against trouble and loneliness. A sunny, cozy place, all of our own. And you'll do this, and I'll do that. And we'll never want it to be any other way again, ever, for the rest of our lives.
To understand what women's financial lives looked like before 1974, you have to understand the world they were living in. So harder, and it starts, as so many stories do, with World War II. When American men shipped off to war in 1941, something remarkable happened. Women filled their jobs, they ran factories, they operated heavy machinery, they managed payrolls, they kept the American economy functioning while the men were gone. By 1945, 37% of the entire American civilian workforce was female. 37% building ships, manufacturing weapons, coding early computers. Then the war ended. And almost overnight, the jobs disappeared. Companies didn't just stop hiring women. They actively fired them to make room for returning men, changed job descriptions to justify lower pay, built entire systems designed to keep women in specific roles that didn't threaten the financial order. And here is the thing that still stuns me when I think about it. These women, who had just proven they could do everything men could do, went home, became wives, became housewives. Not always by choice, often because the financial system gave them no other viable option. Because without financial independence, without a bank account, a credit line, a lease in your own name, you cannot choose. You can only depend. Let's get specific. Because this isn't just a vague cultural story, there were actual laws, written and enforced. Before 1974, a married woman in the United States could not open a bank account without her husband's permission, could not apply for a credit card in her own name, could not sign a lease without a male co-signer, a husband, a father, sometimes literally any man who would vouch for her. If she divorced, she lost access to the family's shared credit history. Banks would refuse to recognize her history of payments as hers alone, because legally the account had been his. If she was widowed, the situation was often just as bad. Decades of careful financial management, and suddenly she was starting from zero, an adult woman treated as if she had no financial identity whatsoever. And in the workplace, the Equal Pay Act wasn't signed until 1963. Even then, enforcement was minimal. Women doing identical jobs to men were legally paid less. Entire industries openly advertised separate pay scales based on gender. This wasn't hidden, it was policy. Pregnant? You lost your job. Most employers could and did fire women the moment they became visibly pregnant, because pregnancy was considered incompatible with professional work. Not incompatible with factory work during a war, mind you. Just incompatible with professional work during peacetime. The message was clear and consistent. Your financial life belongs to someone else. Your labor is valuable. Your independence is not. Change, when it came, didn't come from governments waking up one morning with a conscience. It came from women who pushed until the system moved. In 1963, Esther Peterson, a labor activist who had spent decades fighting for workers, lobbied President Kennedy directly. The Equal Pay Act passed that year. Imperfect, under-enforced, but real. In 1964, sex discrimination was added to the Civil Rights Act, almost as an afterthought, added by a congressman who opposed the whole bill and thought gender equality would make it look ridiculous. He was wrong. It passed, and suddenly workplace discrimination based on sex was illegal. In 1966, the National Organization for Women was founded. Within months, they were suing the government for failing to enforce the laws that already existed. And then, in 1974, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. The law that finally, explicitly, made it illegal to deny someone a bank account or a credit card based on their sex or marital status. 1974. 50 years ago, the women who fought for this weren't radicals to most of us today. They were asking for things so basic we struggle to imagine them being up for debate. The right to have a bank account, the right to rent an apartment, the right to borrow money to start a business. These weren't demands for special treatment, they were demands to be treated as people. Here is what I want you to really sit with. Not the legal history, the human experience of it. Imagine you are a woman in 1965. You have a university degree, you work full-time, you are good at your job, perhaps better than many of the men around you who earn more. You pay your rent, your bills, your groceries, and yet, if your husband leaves you, you have no credit history, no ability to rent a new apartment without a man to vouch for you, no bank account in your own name. You have been working your whole adult life, and you have nothing that is legally yours. Now, imagine applying for a credit card. The bank calls your husband to ask if he approves. He says no. The application is denied. That's it. That's the whole conversation. Or imagine being pregnant. You love your work, you're good at it. Your boss calls you in on a Monday morning and tells you that unfortunately, given the situation, they'll need to let you go. You have no legal protection, no recourse. You thank him and leave. This wasn't the experience of a minority. This was the daily reality of the majority of American women for most of the 20th century. And the women who lived through it. Many of them didn't even have the language to call it wrong because it had always been this way. Because everyone around them said it was natural. Because the films, the advertisements, the textbooks, the laws all told the same story. Women belong at home. Women need to be taken care of. Women cannot manage their own affairs. The most powerful kind of injustice is the kind that gets called common sense. It takes an extraordinary amount of courage to look at common sense and say, this is wrong. Here is the number I want you to hold in your mind: 50 years. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act passed in 1974. That means there are women alive today who remember being denied a bank account, who remember being fired for being pregnant, who remember what it felt like to have no financial identity separate from their husbands. Your grandmother might be one of them, your mother might be one of them, and while so much has changed, the gender pay gap still exists. Women still earn on average less than men for comparable work. Women still hold fewer senior leadership positions. Women still carry a disproportionate share of unpaid domestic labor that never appears in any economic calculation. The legal architecture was dismantled 50 years ago. But architecture takes time to rebuild. What's remarkable is not how far we still have to go. What's remarkable is how recently the legal barriers fell, and how quickly, once they fell, women moved. In 1960, roughly 15% of managers in the US were women. By 2009, nearly 40% were. In one generation. Not because women suddenly became more capable, because they were finally allowed to try. The next time you open your banking app, the next time you tap your card, sign a lease, apply for anything in your own name, you're doing something that millions of women before you were legally prevented from doing. Not because they couldn't, not because they weren't ready, because somebody decided they shouldn't. And then, slowly, painfully, over decades, other people decided differently. History isn't something that happened a long time ago to other people. Sometimes history is your grandmother's story. Sometimes it's 50 years ago, and sometimes the most radical thing that ever happened was simply being allowed to open a bank account.